This is Don Drysdale. I bet you didn't know that the sport of rowing attracts hundreds of thousands of people every year. Well, it does, and today I'm going to tell you about the very first historic meeting between those arch rivals, Harvard and Yale, and boy, what a race that was. This program is presented as a public service of the station in cooperation with your local Army representative. He can offer you training in any one of over 200 exciting careers that are good for a lifetime in or out of the service. Call him soon and get all the details. Now, our story. When most Americans think of rowing competitions, they picture some stuffy old Englishmen standing in their tweeds, cheering an oversized canoe. Well, let me tell you, if that's what you think, you're all wet. For over 150 years, the annual regatta in England, celebrating the athletic competition of rowing, has been one of the most exciting sports spectacles in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people from all over the globe crowd the banks of the Thames River just to see this remarkable event. It was started on March 26, 1839, at Henley-on-Thames, Oxfordshire, England. It was the first meeting between two teams that were to become arch rivals. They belonged to those old and noble colleges of Cambridge and Oxford. It was to be a very important and historic race, not only because the competitors were ancient enemies, but also because it was the first time a simple collegiate sport was elevated into the public eye. Both teams were ready to go. On the Cambridge side stood three incredible athletes of the five-man team. They were Lord Darnley of Hampshire, Lord Croswell of Berwick, and the young Earl of Norwich. Pretty fancy titles for three guys who weren't even 20 years old. But these fellows were no dandies. They were darn good athletes, and Cambridge was confident of a win that day. But Oxford was not to be slighted. Not only did they have the remarkable coxswain Reggie Smith, but the team of unbeatable oarsmen. Right about now, you're probably wondering what the heck is a coxswain. Well, I'm going to tell you about that and some other interesting things in just a moment. First, here's some good news from the United States Army. Some people claim they can build boys into men. Well, today's Army needs men for jobs boys can't handle: armor, infantry, or artillery. Tough jobs that test your stamina, strain your muscles, work your mind. Try on a man's job in Army Combat Arms. Join the people who've joined the Army. Now back to our story. Most Americans don't really know just how exciting the sport can be. For instance, did you know that Princess Grace of Monaco's father, John Kelly, was the first American to take 3 Olympic gold medals in rowing? And I bet you didn't know even what a coxswain was. Well, here's the guy who sits in the front of the boat with a bullhorn in front of his mouth and sets the pace for the rowers. And now, to continue our story. Cambridge and Oxford, the two leading colleges of Britain, had staged the first regatta of rowing in the nation's history. It took place at Henley-on-Thames in Oxfordshire, England, and a 1.25-mile course was lined with spectators. Although Cambridge had been boasting for weeks, Oxford was really the team to watch because they were the ones that won. An entire ocean away, another contest was being planned. It was between two other arch rivals, Harvard and Yale. It was the first sporting duel between the two rivals. The event was set for August 3rd and was to take place on Lake Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire. There was no way to guess beforehand who the victor would be. Both teams were really great, but everyone was a little concerned about the chances of Harvard. The oarsmen didn't seem to be putting in much practice time. In fact, no one could remember seeing them on the water in recent weeks. Was this some new psychological strategy, or were they just practicing in secret? Only their coach knew for sure, and he wasn't talking. The big day finally arrived, and everyone was dying of curiosity. Most of all, the fellows on the Yale team. In 45 minutes, the race was over, and Harvard, in the sleek boat Oneida, had won. When asked about their curious manner of non-practice, the smiling team admitted that they had rowed together only a dozen times before the race for fear of blistering their hands. This is Don Drysdale. Your local Army representative can put you in a winning position. He can hand you a career that's good for a lifetime. So see him today and join the people who've joined the Army. Until next time, so long, everyone. This is Don Drysdale. It's common knowledge today that rewards that go to professional athletes are by no means insignificant. Amateurs, too, receive good compensation. not only in the thrill of achievement, but in the form of elaborate and valuable trophies and awards. Today, I'm going to tell you some fascinating facts about the evolution of trophy giving. This program is presented as a public service of this station in cooperation with your local Army representative. He can offer you over 200 exciting and rewarding careers to choose from in today's Army. Why not call him today and get all the details? Now, our story. The practice of awarding trophies can be traced all the way back to the ancient Greeks. In fact, the word trophy comes from a Greek expression and means a memorial of victory in war. In 776 B.C., when Greece staged its first major Olympic Games, the trophy took the form of a wreath made of olive leaves from the trees of the sacred Mount Olympus. Several hundred years later, trophies again came into the news. It was in the year 1512 in the beautiful town of Chester, England. The occasion was the annual 4-mile horse race, and the winner was given a wooden ball decked out with flowers. By the year 1540, it had been replaced with a silver shell, and silver then became trophy metal for the first time in history. But within the next 20 years, trophies became so ornate that they were worth literally a king's ransom. I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. First, here's some good news from today's Army. It takes a special kind of person to stand up and be counted, someone who welcomes a challenge, someone who wants more out of life than just picking up a paycheck. Find out about the challenge and responsibility available with the Army's Combat Arms Enlistment option. Check it out with your nearest Army representative. Do something for yourself and your country when you join the people who've joined the Army. Now back to our story. The practice of trophy giving is a tradition that has gone on since the beginning of civilization. First mentioned in the records of the ancient Greek Olympiads, the awards were then small, but by no means insignificant. Olive leaves from the sacred Mount of Olympus were prized beyond money. Yet, the winners were also allowed to build monuments to themselves that would last long after the sacred leaves had turned to dust. In 1512, the lovely English town of Chester re-established the practice of trophy giving, when the winners of the annual 4-mile horse race were awarded wooden balls covered with flowers. By 1540, this trophy had evolved into a silver shell, and silver became trophy metal for the first time. In 1572, Queen Elizabeth I decided to reward the leading athletes of her day. The trophies were really spectacular. Large silver cups that weighed by themselves 10 pounds were set with rubies, emeralds, and pearls. Furthermore, the names of the men who had achieved this honor were engraved in gold leaf. Now that's what I call a trophy. 60 years later, the followers of the then exiled King James decided to pawn another trophy in order to raise money for the king's return. The trophy they chose was a solid gold cup which had over 250 sapphires embedded in it. It had been a reward to the Earl of Leicester for his performance as a horseman. As you can guess, with the money raised from this priceless treasure, the king was returned. The first trophy ever given in America was presented in 1668 by the first British governor of the colony of New York. It weighed 15 pounds and was presented to the owner of the winning horse in the Hampstead Plains race. But by far the most valuable trophy ever given to an amateur athlete was that given to Sergei Alexandrova, the third Viscount of Russia. It was a golden peacock whose feathers were studded with $100,000 worth of precious jewels. Now, it may seem funny that amateurs could accept these valuable prizes and still remain in their standing. But a long-standing rule has come down to us from the ancient Greeks, and it still applies today. No matter how rich and precious a trophy is, it will not affect the status of the amateur who accepts it. However, if this same amateur were to accept even $1 in prize money, he would then lose his amateur standings forever. This is Don Drysdale. Your local Army representative has some pretty valuable news for you. It can change your standing and make you a winner. Get the details soon and join the people who've joined the Army. Till next time, so long, everyone. This is Don Drysdale. Today we take for granted the ease in which athletes can travel from city to city, but 100 years ago it wasn't that easy. Today I'm going to tell you about the first baseball team ever to go on tour and the zany and often unpredictable things that happened to them along the way. This program is presented by today's Army. Your local Army representative can show you how to find a demanding and rewarding career that's good for a lifetime in or out of the service. Now, our story. It takes place in 1871, just a few short years after the frightening destruction of the Civil War. The town of Washington, D.C. had their very own baseball team. They were called the Nationals, and they were made up entirely of players who worked for the federal government. Like all bureaucrats, it seems they had a lot of free time on their hands, and they must have used it to practice baseball because they were pretty darn good. Well, some wise guy got the bright idea to send them on tour around the country and have the taxpayers foot the bill. Well, as you can guess, the players were all for it, and why shouldn't they be? After all, how often does the government send you on an expense-paid vacation and tell you all you have to do is play baseball? Well, I'll tell you about that eventful trip in just a moment. First, here's an interesting message from today's Army. If you're looking for a challenge, today's Army may be for you. If you're tough enough, jobs are available in one of today's Army combat arms. Good pay and challenging jobs. Check it out today and ask your local Army representative how you can join the people who've joined the Army. Now back to our story. It's about the Nationals, the first baseball team ever to go on tour in the United States. This team was made up entirely of players who worked for the federal government in Washington, D.C. It was to be a 3-week tour, and everyone was looking forward to it. Unfortunately, though, the guy who was in charge of booking the 10-game schedule was friends of a lot of the senators and congressmen in Washington. Every representative thought that his home team was the best and wanted the Nationals to play them to prove it. This probably accounted for the fact that all 10 games were spread out all over the country. The first team that they were to play was in Madison, Wisconsin. Well, the Nationals won the game, but the trip there was less than perfect. One half of the way, these desk-bound bureaucrats were to go by horseback. They were a pretty sore sight to see. The next team they played was way down in Indiana, and again they won the game by a lopsided score of 113-26. Well, you can see what a zigzag they made across America. It was a pretty rocky path, too. In Oklahoma, their train was held up by a bunch of outlaws who were disappointed to find just a bunch of exhausted baseball players on board and nothing much of value. Then it was back to the east, and a game in Pennsylvania where they played against the Pittsburgh Weavers. The score was again kind of strange, 106-21. They played 5 more games after that, all up and down the eastern seaboard, and they won them all. But they weren't without their casualties along the way. Twice their star pitcher was bitten by a horse, but not in his pitching arm. 2 outfielders suffered broken noses when they tried to cross through a pasture, saw an angry bull approaching, and ran smack into each other. But the saddest injury of all was when the Nationals' first baseman, young Tommy Vandermint, incurred the wrath of a few local spectators who pelted him with no less than 3 dozen rotten eggs. Well, he tried valiantly to continue the game, but unfortunately couldn't stand the aroma, and he had to leave. All in all, everyone had a lot of fun, and it covered a surprising 2,400 miles. The Nationals' only defeat was inflicted by an unheard-of team which was based in Rockford, Illinois. This team's pitcher, a 17-year-old boy, would later in his life become one of the most famous names in the history of baseball. After all, where would baseball be without Albert Goodwill Spaulding? This is Don Drysdale. Your local Army representative can show you how to make a name for yourself. See him soon and find out about an exciting career that can last a lifetime. Just pick up the phone and join the people who've joined the Army. Until next time, so long, everyone. This is Don Drysdale. College football is full of surprises because the players are young, have limited experience, and are emotional about their game. It's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen in any given game. Today, I'll tell you about a team that had 2 big surprises in one day, one good, one bad. I'll give you the bad news in just a moment. This program is brought to you as a public service of this station and your local Army recruiter. Today's Army will train you in the job you want to learn and guarantee you of career placement in writing before you enlist. Find out about a job with a future in today's Army. Now the good news and the bad news. 2 surprises that happened to the Boston College football team in one day in 1942. First, the bad news. As far back as I can remember, Boston College has had football teams they were proud of. It's a tradition that still goes on today. Well, in 1942, OBC had a dynamite club. It was the football team that couldn't lose. Their offense was unstoppable. Their defense was invulnerable. When the other team had the ball, they crushed the quarterback and forced turnover after turnover. When they had the ball, their line cut holes in the center of the field big enough for a marching band, while their fleet-footed receivers plucked passes out of the defenders' hands for giant gains. Boston College was named number 1 in every football poll in America. They were good, and they were lucky. And they were never luckier than they were on November 29th of 1942, when they played their last game of the season against their traditional rival, Holy Cross. There have never been two more different teams playing in one game. Boston was unbeaten, untied, and almost unscored on. The 1942 Holy Cross squad was a patched-together bunch of rookies riddled with injuries and hardly able to move the ball in scrimmage, to say nothing about a real game. In the entire season, Holy Cross had narrowly won only 4 games against mediocre teams that weren't much better than high school caliber. The idea of the two meeting in a so-called big game was a joke. But like I said earlier, you never know what's going to happen in college football. And everything that could happen did on that cold November afternoon. The Holy Cross Crusaders came into the game fired up. A win here could salvage their miserable season. Boston College, on the other hand, was more concerned with the victory dance scheduled for later that evening than they were with the game that day. There was no question that they would win. Of course, they didn't. Holy Cross creamed them. The final score was Boston College 12, Holy Cross 55. It was one of the most unbelievable upsets in collegiate football history. When the humiliated Boston team left the field that day, they had no idea that this horrible loss would be the luckiest thing that ever happened to them. I'll tell you about the good news in just a moment. First, here's some good news from today's Army. Do you feel like you're in a rut? Maybe what you need is a challenge. Today's Army has tough, demanding jobs for young men and women. When you qualify, you pick your job, and the Army will guarantee it. Call or visit your nearest Army representative today. Get out of the rut and join the people who've joined the Army. Now back to our story. It's about an unbeaten Boston College team that was totally demolished in their last game of the season by a mediocre bunch of losers from Holy Cross. The final score was 55-12. And it was a sad bunch of beaners who shuffled into the showers after the game. For most of them, it was the saddest day of their lives. Their confidence had betrayed them, and they had been humbled badly. What none of them knew until the next day was that this loss had saved their lives. You see, most of them had planned to go out that night and celebrate their unbeaten season as the national #1 team. Instead, they went home, unable to face the fans, and luckily they didn't, because that night, the party that they would have attended turned into a tragedy. The Coconut Grove Club, where the victory dance was staged, caught fire, and 492 people were killed in the flames. But because of their strange loss to Holy Cross, the Bostonians escaped to play again. This is Don Drysdale. You're in luck when you start a career with a future. And that's what you'll do when you join the people who've joined the Army. Till next time, so long, everyone. This is Don Drysdale. Today, we take for granted the ease in which athletes can transport themselves to compete anywhere in the world. But not so long ago, things were just a little bit harder. Today, I'm going to tell you about the very first historic meeting between England and the United States in an athletic competition and the really crazy problems our visitors from overseas faced. This program is presented by your local Army representative. He can offer you over 200 exciting and demanding careers in today's Army. So see him soon and get all the details. Now, our story. The London Athletic Club had boasted for years that when it came for field and track, no one could beat their athletes. After all, their membership included the best amateurs from all over Britain. In fact, it was really hard even to get accepted as a member in this exclusive club. If a promising young athlete wanted to be nominated, he not only had to prove himself in 3 qualifying contests, he also had to subject himself to semifinals, finals, and an exhausting oral examination by the club's board members. But if he could make his way through all this testing, he was in for life.
And what a life it was. Being a member of the London Athletic Club was a great reward for any amateur athlete. 4 times yearly, the club staged tournaments for their members. They also sent them on tours to other countries, paying for their transportation, meals, lodging, and whatever little extras they felt the athletes deserved. The royalty of most of Europe entertained the members of the club, often staging unofficial tournaments just for fun. It was also rumored that if an athlete came upon hard times financially, the members would group together and help their buddy out. So it really is understandable when the members declared that the only institution to which they were more devoted was England itself. You can imagine what an uproar was started when the brash young athletes of the New York Athletic Club challenged this old and venerated organization. Now the London club had never even thought of crossing the Atlantic to compete with the Americans, and this challenge really took them by surprise. But never underestimate the pluck of an Englishman. In a 4-hour board meeting, the decision was voted upon. On September 21st, they'd meet the Yanks in New York. But those poor fellows didn't figure on one very important thing, and I'll tell you the amusing details in just a moment. First, here's a message from today's Army. George Washington knew that an army couldn't function without good food and plenty of it. 200 years later, this is still true. Today's Army needs young men and women to be Army cooks. Your job and assignment are guaranteed when you qualify. Get cooking when you join the people who've joined the Army. Now back to our story. When the respected old institution, the London Athletic Club, got a letter on June 3, 1895, they never suspected the problems they'd have to face. After all, it was only a simple challenge from those Yankee upstarts in the New York Athletic Club, inviting them to meet on September 21st. The English accepted the challenge and just knew that whatever those Yankees could do, well, they certainly could do better. All that summer, the members of the 20-man appointed team practiced like crazy, and by the end of August, they knew they were ready. There was only one thing they weren't ready for, but it was a pretty big thing. It was the Atlantic Ocean. The crossing wasn't rough. It was a 2.5-week nightmare. There wasn't enough Dramamine in the world, and they didn't even have it then, to take care of those poor green-faced athletes. As if that wasn't enough, there was a big storm which delayed the boat an extra 5 days. Well, you can probably guess the condition that they were in when they finally reached New York. Those poor guys had to face 2 solid days of banquets and speeches before the actual meet took place. On September 21st, 1895, the pride of the London Athletic Club walked onto the field. Well, maybe walked isn't exactly the right word. It was more like wobbled. 3 hours later, the inevitable results were in. Out of the 11 events scheduled, the London Athletic Club had to its credit not one single win. The Yankees had taken the day. This is Don Drysdale. Your local Army representative can show you how to take the day. He can steer you through the rough waters of the job market by offering you training in a career that's good for a lifetime, in or out of the service. Call him today and join the people who've joined the Army. Till next time, so long, everyone.